Would you ever willingly follow an evil leader? Most of us would instantly say, absolutely not. We like to believe that we would see through their lies, resist manipulation, and stand firm in our values. After all, we have history to guide us. We know how authoritarian regimes have destroyed societies. We know how dictators have used fear to control the masses. We tell ourselves that we are smarter than those who fell for their deception. But here's the unsettling truth. History tells a different story. Again and again, even intelligent, rational, and deeply moral people have followed leaders who were corrupt, ruthless, and deceptive. It has happened in democracies, in highly educated societies, in places where people once believed they were free. So the real question isn't just why evil leaders rise to power, but why good people let them. Centuries ago, philosopher Thomas Hobbes offered a disturbing answer. He argued that people don't choose tyranny because they love it. They choose it because they fear something worse. When chaos threatens to consume a society, when order crumbles, when people feel unsafe, fear becomes stronger than freedom. People don't look for justice, they look for protection, and they are willing to surrender almost anything to get it, even their morality. Hobbes warned that the fall of a nation and the rise of tyranny never begin with evil people. They begin with good people making small, seemingly logical choices. They compromise, little by little, because they are afraid. They tell themselves it's temporary, that they are only giving up a little control for security. But before they know it, those small choices snowball into a terrifying reality, where obedience is no longer a choice, and the leader they once feared now rules them completely. We've seen it happen time and time again. Democracies collapse. Governments that once stood for justice become oppressive. Societies that valued freedom wake up one day to find themselves under the rule of an iron fist. And the most unsettling part? The people allow it to happen because they believe they have no other choice. So today, we're going to explore the darkest and most dangerous insight from Hobbes. We're going to break down why good people follow evil leaders, how fear transforms free societies into controlled ones, and why this pattern keeps repeating throughout history. But before we continue, ask yourself this. Would you rather live under a brutal, controlling ruler, or in a world of total anarchy where there are no rules at all? If your instinct is to say neither, then you're already thinking the way most people do. But history shows that when fear becomes overwhelming, people rarely have the luxury of that choice. When faced with chaos, they almost always choose control, even if it comes at the cost of their own freedom. By the end of this, you may realize that evil leaders don't rise to power by force alone. More often, power is given to them, willingly, and once it happens, breaking free is never easy. The war of all against all, the roots of fear. Imagine a world with no rules, no government, no structure, just pure, unrestricted human nature. Sounds exciting, right? Maybe even freeing? But Thomas Hobbes didn't think so. In fact, he believed that such a world would be the most terrifying existence imaginable. Hobbes called this the state of nature, a world where there is no common authority to keep people in check. And in this world, life wouldn't be peaceful or harmonious. It would be, as Hobbes famously put it, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He didn't come to this conclusion from a place of abstract philosophy. He lived through one of the bloodiest conflicts in history, the English Civil War. He saw what happened when government collapsed, when once civilized people turned against each other. He witnessed the violence, the betrayals, and the raw desperation for survival. This led him to a harsh but undeniable truth. Without a powerful authority to maintain order, people will do whatever it takes to survive. This fear of collapse is buried deep in our psychology. It's why, when we see instability, riots, lawlessness, or government dysfunction, we instinctively crave stability, even if it means giving up some of our freedoms. Hobbes argued that people don't naturally seek freedom, they seek security, and this is precisely where tyranny begins. From a psychological perspective, this ties into Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, the darker, primal instincts within us that we like to ignore. When societies break down, those instincts rise to the surface. The fear of death, suffering, and lawlessness overpowers everything else. People are no longer guided by morality, ethics, or justice. They're guided by fear. But here's the problem. Fear makes people easy to control. It makes them desperate for a savior. And that's where power-hungry leaders step in. They don't need to force people to follow them. They just need to convince them that they are the only thing standing between them and chaos. That's why history's worst leaders didn't rise to power simply because they were strong or ruthless. They rose because people were afraid. They saw their leader as a necessary evil, better than the alternative of anarchy. So ask yourself this: if you were faced with complete lawlessness, would you willingly surrender your freedom for stability? Because that's exactly what millions of people have done throughout history, and they did it thinking they were making the right choice. The cosmic dance of order and chaos. The struggle between chaos and order is as old as human civilization itself. Every culture, every ancient mythology, every philosophical tradition has wrestled with the same question: how do we balance control and freedom? Take ancient Chinese philosophy, for example. The concept of yin and yang describes the natural balance between opposing forces: chaos and order, destruction and creation. Too much chaos leads to anarchy, but too much order leads to oppression. Civilizations that fail to find this balance always fall, either consumed by internal disorder or crushed under the weight of authoritarian rule. In Norse mythology, this struggle is reflected in the prophecy of Ragnarok, a time when the gods will fight against the forces of chaos, leading to destruction and rebirth. And in Zoroastrianism, the universe is seen as a battleground between light and darkness, good and evil. But what does all this have to do with real-world politics? Because tyranny doesn't rise when there is too much order. It rises when chaos becomes unbearable. People who are terrified of instability will accept almost any solution to end it. This is why powerful leaders often manufacture crises. They understand that nothing makes people more obedient than fear, and history shows that this pattern repeats over and over. When the Roman Republic collapsed, people didn't resist dictatorship, they welcomed it. When Germany was in crisis after World War I, the people turned to a leader who promised to restore order, no matter the cost. Even today, we see governments use fear, whether it's terrorism, economic collapse, or social disorder, to justify more control. Every time a crisis emerges, more power shifts toward those in authority, and people accept it, believing it's for their own safety. But here's the paradox. Once power is surrendered, it is rarely returned. So the next time a leader claims they need more control for the good of society, ask yourself, are they truly restoring balance, or are they exploiting fear to tighten their grip? The social contract, freedom or submission. So, if people are so terrified of chaos, how do they protect themselves from it? Hobbes had an answer: the social contract. The idea is simple. People agree to give up some of their freedoms in exchange for protection. They accept laws, rulers, and authority, not because they love being controlled, but because they believe it's necessary to maintain order. Hobbes believed that this was the only way to prevent society from collapsing into chaos. Without a strong ruler, he argued, people would destroy each other. That's why he proposed the idea of a single, all-powerful sovereign, the Leviathan. But here's where things get dangerous. When people hand over their freedoms, where do they draw the line? At what point does necessary control become oppression? And if they've already given up some of their power, what's stopping their rulers from taking more? History shows that once a government gains control over its people, it doesn't willingly give it back. Power, once consolidated, becomes almost impossible to dismantle. And over time, people forget what real freedom even looked like. This is where Stockholm Syndrome kicks in. People don't just obey their rulers out of fear. They start to rationalize their obedience. They convince themselves that their leaders are acting in their best interest, even when they're not. This explains why dictatorships don't just survive by force. They survive because people accept them. So the real question is, if we had to choose between chaos and control, would we even realize when we've chosen too much control? Or would we accept it until we have nothing left to give? The utility of fear. How leaders manufacture crises. Here's something most people don't realize. Fear isn't just a natural response. It's a tool. And the most powerful leaders throughout history have used it to control entire populations. Think about it. When people are afraid, they become predictable. They stop thinking rationally. They crave stability. They look for someone who can save them. And that's exactly how authoritarian leaders get people to support them. They don't need to take power. They just need to convince people that they need them. This is why propaganda is so effective. Governments use fear-based messaging to make people believe they are constantly under threat. And when fear becomes overwhelming, people stop asking questions. This is why, historically, some of the most brutal leaders came into power during times of crisis. They used fear to convince people that they were the only solution, and people believed them. So next time a leader says, "We need more power to keep you safe," ask yourself, are they really protecting you? Or are they making sure you stay afraid? The illusion of choice. Are we truly free? Many people believe they live in a free society. They believe they make their own choices, that they aren't controlled. They believe democracy protects them from tyranny, that free speech ensures truth prevails, and that modern civilization has moved beyond the manipulative tactics of the past. But Hobbes argued something different. People are never truly free, because fear always governs their decisions. Even in societies that claim to value liberty, fear dictates which freedoms people cling to and which they willingly give up. The fear of crime makes people accept mass surveillance. The fear of instability makes them tolerate government overreach. The fear of the other makes them justify prejudice, even when it contradicts their values. In reality, most of the choices we think we have are carefully controlled illusions. Governments, media, and institutions don't just govern laws, they govern perception. They control not just what people believe, but what they are even capable of considering. What does that mean? It means that when we think we are making independent choices, we are often just picking from pre-approved options. Consider this. Every time a major crisis happens, whether economic, political, or social, the same thing follows. A narrow set of solutions is presented. The public is told there are only two choices: accept this policy or face disaster. But is that really true? Or is it simply the framework we have been given? This is what French philosopher Jacques Ellul called prefabricated opinion. Most people don't form their beliefs. They inherit them from institutions that manufacture consent. The way issues are framed in news media, the selective use of history, the narratives that reinforce power structures, all of it conditions people to think they are making rational decisions, when in reality, they are simply reacting to an environment engineered to produce specific outcomes. Even more disturbing is the illusion of rebellion. People are often given controlled opposition, false choices that make them believe they are resisting when they are actually reinforcing the system. Think about modern political debates. Every few years, people are told that one side represents freedom and the other represents tyranny. But somehow, regardless of which side wins, the same larger structures of control remain in place. Psychologists call this bounded rationality. Humans don't process every possible alternative. They only consider the options they are given. If those options are controlled, then so are the decisions people make. So the real question isn't just whether we are free. The real question is, do we even know when we are being controlled? Because if the most powerful form of control is the one we cannot see, then how would we ever know if we were truly free? The ritual of control, how power becomes sacred. There's a moment in history when rulers stop being just leaders and start becoming something more, something untouchable, almost sacred. It happens when people stop seeing them as ordinary humans and start believing they are the only source of stability, security, and survival. Think about it. Why do so many leaders, especially authoritarian ones, tie themselves to religion, tradition, or some higher divine force? It's not a coincidence. It's a strategy. Because when power is seen as sacred, it becomes unquestionable. Hobbes himself recognized this in his work Leviathan. He argued that rulers must be feared and revered like a mythical beast, a force so powerful that no one would dare challenge it. Otherwise, the social order would collapse. We see this same pattern throughout history. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs were considered gods. In medieval Europe, kings ruled by divine right, meaning they weren't just leaders, they were chosen by God himself. Even in modern times, dictators have used religious or ideological narratives to justify their rule, making themselves more than just men. And when leaders elevate themselves to this untouchable status, something terrifying happens. Morality stops mattering. People no longer judge rulers based on ethics, honesty, or justice. Instead, they judge them on how effectively they maintain order. It doesn't matter if they are cruel or oppressive. As long as they are strong, they are seen as necessary. This is why totalitarian regimes don't just demand obedience, they demand faith. Once people believe in their leader, even the worst actions become justifiable. And the deeper this belief goes, the harder it is to break. So the question isn't just why do people follow bad leaders? The real question is, when does following a leader become a kind of worship? And once that happens, how do people ever break free? The worship of the leader, when power becomes divine. At what point does loyalty become worship? History shows us that once a leader is seen as indispensable, they become irreplaceable. Their followers don't just support them, they defend them, justify them, and even rewrite history to make them seem like saviors. This is why dictators are often surrounded by cult-like devotion. Their supporters believe that questioning them would be the same as questioning survival itself. And when that happens, logic no longer matters. This is where mass psychology takes over. The collective mind replaces individual reasoning. People who once had doubts convince themselves that they were wrong. They erase contradictions in their memories. They rewrite the past to make sense of the present. This is why, even after a tyrant falls, many of their followers still refuse to believe they were ever wrong. It's not just about politics anymore. It's about identity. And this is what makes tyranny so dangerous. Because once people have committed themselves to a leader in this way, they will defend them at any cost. Not because they are forced to, but because they genuinely believe there is no other option. So here's the real question. If your leader did something undeniably wrong, would you still support them? If you hesitate to answer, you might already know the truth. The final surrender, when fear becomes faith. Fear and faith are closer than most people realize. At first, people follow leaders out of fear. Fear of chaos, fear of instability, fear of an uncertain future. But over time, that fear transforms into something else. It becomes faith. Not faith in a religious sense, but faith in the idea that the leader is necessary. That no matter what they do, no matter how much power they take, the alternative is always worse. This is why many of history's most brutal regimes weren't just tolerated, they were defended by their own people. Because the scariest thing to admit isn't that the leader is bad, it's that you were wrong to follow them. Admitting that would mean admitting that you traded your freedom for nothing, that you justified cruelty, oppression, and violence because you were afraid. So instead of facing that painful truth, people double down. They become more loyal, more aggressive in their defense. They tell themselves that necessary evils were unavoidable, that history will judge things differently, that outsiders just don't understand. But deep down, the fear never really goes away. It just becomes something they refuse to question. And at that point, the leader no longer needs to justify anything. They have already won. Breaking the cycle, can we escape? So is there a way out? History suggests that once power becomes absolute, it almost never lets go voluntarily. When leaders seize control through fear, they don't just step down. They don't return power to the people. They hold on to it until they are forced to give it up. So if that's the case, how do societies ever escape? There are only two ways: collapse or resistance. Either the regime collapses under its own weight, economic failure, internal corruption, civil unrest, or people wake up to the illusion and fight back. But here's the problem. Most people don't realize they are trapped until it's too late. The longer people justify their obedience, the harder it is to undo. The more they rationalize tyranny, the less they believe they need to resist. And when that happens, societies don't just fall into dictatorship, they willingly maintain it. So the real question is, if you were living under tyranny right now, would you even know it? Or would you be one of the people defending it? The future of power. Will we choose fear again? We like to believe that history won't repeat itself, that because we have learned from the past, we won't make the same mistakes again. But here's the truth. Human nature hasn't changed. People still fear chaos more than they love freedom. They still crave strong leadership in times of uncertainty. they still tell themselves that a little control is a fair price for stability. And every time fear takes over, the same pattern repeats. We saw it in the fall of the Roman Republic. We saw it in the rise of totalitarian states in the 20th century. We see it even today in the growing acceptance of authoritarian policies around the world. So ask yourself, when the next crisis comes, will people once again trade their freedom for security, or will they finally recognize the illusion for what it is? The ultimate question, what will you choose? So here we are. After everything we've discussed, after exploring how fear leads to control, how people surrender their freedoms willingly, and how history has followed the same cycle for centuries, there's only one question left. Will we allow it to happen again? Hobbes believed that people will always choose control over chaos, that when faced with uncertainty, they will always accept authority, no matter the cost. But is that truly inevitable? Maybe the problem isn't that people don't value freedom. Maybe the real problem is that people don't recognize when they're losing it. Tyranny never arrives with a loud announcement. It creeps in slowly, quietly, in small, logical steps. It always starts as necessary control, as temporary measures, as rules meant to protect. And before people realize what's happening, they have already lost the ability to resist. So when the next crisis comes, and it always does, ask yourself, are you choosing your leaders based on reason? Or are you choosing them because you are afraid? Because that single decision might be the one that changes everything.